Hello, my name is Dr. Nicholas Matt, and I teach transgender studies at the University of Toronto's Merck S. Bonham Centre for Sexual Diversity Studies. I'm coming to you today to share some of what I've been teaching and we've been discussing in my Introduction to Transgender Studies course. And in the coming week, we're going to also be posting videos from other faculty who are teaching transpositive materials and finding ways to create transpositive environments in their classrooms. So please do stay tuned for more details on that, as well as an event that we're holding later this week called the Transpositive Teach-In. And there we're going to have faculty come and give longer versions of what they do in their classrooms to provide transpositive space for students and also to teach trans-competent methods and research. So we'd like to share some of that with you here today. To keep things brief and in the interest of time, I can say that there's been a lot in the media lately, as there often is, around trans representations, authority. It's a very complicated situation. So most people aren't in a very good position to make sense of it. And of course, a lot of our media exposure happens quickly and doesn't necessarily get a second thought. So in our trans studies course, developing critical media awareness is a really important component to being able to understand how trans people face limitations in our world and why the barriers and mindsets that prevent our world from being more inclusive, why is it that people remain closed-minded and continue to create barriers? Media representations and the way that media handles trans people and issues is one of the answers that we talk about. So last week we were reading a piece from Dr. Vivian MSD's excellent and very accessible book called Sex Change, Social Change, Reflections on Identities, Institutions, and Imperialism. So if you're watching from home, that's an excellent resource to pick up. The chapter that we were reading was called Beyond Image Content. And that's to draw attention to the fact that content often erases context. And that's a trans issue because context can be everything. Every person, every situation is completely unique. The power dynamics, the language, the frameworks, the feelings, the reactions, the social dynamics, these are all specific to individuals in particular circumstances. Though we live in a world that is full of transphobia and cisnormativity, unfortunately. And if you're not familiar with those terms, you can look into them more, and certainly if you were in our class, we would expand on them, and perhaps in future videos we will. But in this video, I just want to draw people's attention to some of the elements of trans representations in media that we should be aware of when we are exposed to some kind of media representation. So Vivian MSD argues and demonstrates in her chapter, which you can read and look into in more detail, several different ways that trans people have been consistently treated by how mainstream media just works or has worked. Now some of this is changing, and so one of the things that we do is develop the ability to chart those changes over time, because that's a way that we can start to see how barriers can be reduced, how positive changes are happening, and very importantly, how we can see the gaps in terms of policies that we think will help versus what happens in the real world. So that's a major component of what we study in our class. What happens in theory is not what happens in practice, and when it comes to trans people and issues, there's a lot of emphasis trying to keep things theoretical. It's really important. Trans advocates and trans people have been saying and consistently demonstrating what a significant difference it makes to have trans voices on trans topics doing trans work. That doesn't mean you have to be trans to do trans research, or that if you're not trans you can't understand or you don't belong. In fact, it's the opposite. We just know from lived experience as trans people that there's a lot of work to be done. Some of it can be done by trans people, some of it needs to be done by non-trans people. Certainly that's the case in changing mindsets of people who would attack trans people. So in her chapter, beyond image content, namaste names, first off, outright refusal of access. That means that the media censors any stories about trans people. Historically, that's been true, and it bears thinking about what kinds of stories are never allowed to make it into media. So thinking about that and about the history of having been denied access to representation within media and how that influences the people who are alive today who've lived through those, the times when that blatant censorship operated much more explicitly than it does now. Now we have to figure out ways to work through the intricacies of what actually plays out. So outright refusal of access is a really important problem. If the media will not report on you, it is very difficult to make people want to improve your situation. And that goes for many, many groups, obviously. But it's a very poignant problem for trans people. Secondly, she talks about the continued and prolonged dismissal of trans people who have approached and contacted the media. So there's a history of people doing work and having the media refuse to allow that work to be shared. So imagine if you were organizing an event and the media told you that this event was not appropriate and they would not even let you pay them to advertise it. That's something that's happened in trans activism, and it's one of the reasons that people often think that trans activism is something new. So we need to have a critical media awareness to be able to understand that our impressions from media are filtered through a lot of transphobia, systemic and unconscious and historically grounded. Next, very importantly, representations to satisfy the curiosity of the non-trans audience. That's very consistently still a problem. So if you're a non-trans person and you have curiosities, that's totally reasonable. However, it's not totally reasonable that the only time trans people or issues are engaged with is when non-trans people have issues that they would like to satisfy. Next, very important, the autobiographical imperative. And in class last week, one of the questions that we were really sort of wondering about was a student brought up the basic question of why is that a problem? Why is it a problem? Why could it even be a problem to tell people stories? Of course, that's telling stories and telling individual stories that are about lived experience, come from the heart, are spoken in the words, and gesticulated in the ways that are meaningful for the person sharing it. Hugely important. The problem is that historically, trans people have been put into a dynamic of being a subject to be interviewed. And oftentimes, the media was replicating an old psychiatric model of an expert interviewing a person who is considered to be not at the same level as far as power in that dynamic goes. So oftentimes it used to be that, and many of the folks watching this video or listening to the video or otherwise engaged with it will be aware of the fact that many people, let's say anyone over 30, was probably trained to reproduce cisnormativity, to reproduce transphobia by creating a dynamic where a non-trans person questions, investigates, otherwise engages with a trans person in a dynamic where that's not an equal balance of power, and we still don't have an equal balance of power. So the autobiographical imperative, the desire to hear someone's story, or the idea that someone can encapsulate their true authenticity in some kind of narrative framework, that's too limited. We're not quite in a social situation yet where that can stand just on its own merits. And that's the sad thing about why we have to be critical and thinking about and engaged with the complexity around the things that happen. So there's nothing wrong with telling a personal story. It can be greatly empowering. But there is something wrong with the media and others demanding that anybody who is trans has to tell them a story and has to tell them a particular story. And that happens too often. So when you observe that dynamic happening, it's really helpful if you can intervene just by drawing awareness to the fact that this is reproducing a long-standing pattern of You might not want to use those words. You have to figure out the situation you're in, right? You might want to say something that sounds a little more accessible in terms of, I'm not comfortable reproducing a dynamic. I'm not comfortable feeling like I don't have the same power as the person interviewing me. Likewise, if you're a reporter who's seeking sources for a story, don't let the stories be shaped by the person who's decided that they have an agenda to follow from a place of transphobia. So make sure that balanced perspectives are not simply thought of in terms of multiple perspectives. Balanced perspectives look at a justice framework and go from there. So it's really important when we're looking at media pieces to try to understand and be aware of which frameworks have been consciously dismantled in the piece, which are being reinforced, possibly in transphobic pieces, which are being strengthened and drawn upon. We might not be able to tell that if we don't understand the history and the trends and the ways that these things get reproduced. So it's very important, the autobiographical imperative. 2 more. The next one, Vivian Namaste describes as professional transsexuals only, please. And in that section, she's really drawing attention to class-based respectability politics that make it such that only trans voices that look or seem fairly acceptable to mainstream culture are often the only ones heard in mainstream media or recognized as valid or understood, because there's a lot of translating that has to happen in between trans people and issues and broader society when we encounter so many barriers. Including cognitive, intellectual barriers based on years and years of people having been taught really faulty ways of interacting. So we see this happening in a lot of generational shifts these days, and in terms of trans politics and people, it's definitely the case that older people are at a loss, often in terms of both their privilege, unconscious and unrecognized, and also in terms of knowing what to do. How do you teach in a trans-positive way? It's a good question to reflect on, both for educators and for all of us who've had some kind of education. We have education every day in the world, and we have formal education. It's worth reflecting on the question, how many trans-positive environments, learning environments, was I exposed to in my education? Am I exposed to in my day-to-day life? What might that mean for how I'm reproducing things in the world, for what I'm doing in my actions, in my classroom? And as scholars, of course, we want to stay on top of research and always be learning. So that's essential to scholarship. But as human beings, hopefully we all want to be learning to make the world a better place and to be more conscious of the ways that we can make positive contributions to the world. So finally, she notes in a section called "We Love Transsexuals, especially the lesbian and gay ones." Very, very important, because many people now believe that trans people are all within the LGBT or GLBT or LGBTQISSA. Those community formations aren't just about trans people, and often trans people have a really tricky relationship, and those are dependent on specific spaces, competency, knowledge, everything like that. But it's really important to note that if you only think about trans people in relation to LGBT or queer communities, that actually is not where most trans people are. Many, many trans people are straight, heterosexual identified. Many trans people live in a way that no one around them knows that they are trans. And so it really behooves us to not allow tokenization to give the impression that trans people are readily identifiable and that trans people are queer or gay and lesbian. And when we see articles in the mainstream media that consistently refers to trans people as LGBT or only asks LGBT trans people, or rather I should say trans people who are part of the LGBT communities, if we're only listening to those voices, what does that mean for the people who have, who remain invisible? So one of the elements of transpositivity, I would argue, is making visible, acknowledging the fact that there are always trans people around us at all times, including ourselves. And at different points in our lives, we may or may not identify with that term or recognize that experience. But it's really important to know that the mainstream media representation of trans people as queer or LGBT is a very small portion of the puzzle. And it's certainly not enough for us to create good policy, good learning environments, and accurate information about the realities of our society addressing transphobia and cisnormativity. So, in conclusion, you can take Introduction to Trans Studies at U of T. You can email me, although please keep it transpositive. And also you can come to our teach-in later this week. Watch for details on the Bonham Centre SDS website and social media contacts. And stay tuned for more faculty sharing with you how they teach transpositive content and how they create transpositive learning environments for our students and for everyone here at the University of Toronto. So thanks for tuning in, and see you soon.